I'm trying to understand why we don't enable second-hand EVs to be sold in the Australian market.
The reason we didn't allow parallel imports was because we used to have a car-making industry in Australia, and we didn't want people importing a second-hand Vauxhall if there was a Holden being made in Australia. Whenever you think of protectionism, like that was the idea. The irony now is that we don't actually make cars in Australia anymore, but we still have that framework in place.
Hey, Social Democrats, guess what? Our listener survey is now closed. So thank you so much to everyone who took the time to complete it. We do greatly appreciate that. Listeners who filled out the survey were entered into the draw to win a trip to Adelaide, South Australia for the 2026 ALP National Conference, which is happening in July. A huge congratulations to our winner, Thomas Howell. Thomas is a student at the University of Melbourne who is just beginning to explore his interest in politics. So we think, Thomas, you'll get a lot out of this experience, and we can't wait to meet you over in Adelaide and see how you found the ALP National Conference. A big thank you also to our newest Patreon members, Emily Hayward-Smith, Anne-Marie Lockery, and Matt Vining. You can make the most of your membership by going to the Patreon group chats and send in your questions and nominations for our monthly Feeny Files with Jesse McCrone and Mailbag episodes with Lissy Ratcliffe and Todd Pinkerton. And if you're not a member of our Patreon community and you want to join it, there is a link in today's show notes. The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people and organisations who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in your world in 2026, then hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. For over a century, Maurice Blackburn has stood up for fairness, championing the rights of everyday Australians and shaping landmark legal reforms. Today, they're harnessing new technologies to make justice more accessible, more efficient, and more responsive to the needs of modern Australia. All right, let's get on with today's episode. We are taping this one on a Monday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And today is another one of our episodes where we start to look at civic policy or public policy. And everyone knows this is not my area of expertise, and that's why we get the experts in. There's a lot going on in the world right now. A lot of folks are worried about the cost of fuel and cost of living and state of the Australian economy and the impacts and shocks from what's going on overseas. And so we're going to bring in an expert to help us discuss all of that and what that all means. He is a co-founder and partner at Mandala, which is an economics advisory firm. He's an economist, and this is his first time on the show. We're grateful for him to take time out of his busy day to come on. Adam Triggs, welcome to Social Democratic.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We've had your co-founder on the show on previous occasions, Amit. You've obviously drawn the short straw this week and have to come and talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Whatever he said about me is a filthy lie, by the way.
Yeah, we won't share the private chats on the pod. Obviously, we'll get into some more media stuff in a moment, but I always love to sort of get a sense of new guests and what brought them into the work that they're doing today. You're an economist. What's your background? How did you end up working at Mandala?
My career is, you can sort of split into three thirds. Sort of the first third was in government. And so that was at the ACCC. So I originally worked in investigations there with doing a little bit of stuff on fuel, actually, which is very topical at the moment. And at Prime Minister and Cabinet for a few years, working on international sort of issues. The second third was in academia. So I worked at Brookings, which is the think tank in Washington, for a few years, and then worked at the ANU Crawford School for a little time there, working mostly on sort of Asian integration, trade, finance, things like that. And then the final third, not final, hopefully I've got more, but the last third is about working in economics advisory work. So went to work for Andrew Charlton at Alpha Beta. He's now the member for Parramatta and the Minister for the Digital Economy. Then it got acquired by Accenture, and Amit and I broke away and created Mandala, and here we are.
Wonderful. The current third.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
which will then have to be re-edited to become a quarter at some stage as your life continues on.
If something goes really wrong, that will be the case. So.
Exactly. You're not a hockey. You're not a hockey game. You don't operate in thirds.
Yeah, that's right.
So the Australian economy. If you were the treasurer, or a treasurer actually for any of our state or territories prior to another conflict in the Middle East kicking off between Iran and the US and the Gulf states, how would you have painted the picture of the Australian economy at that point? Because obviously all of those treasurers are getting ready to prepare their budgets for the forward financial years. What did the Australian economy look like in that time?
I think in a word, it's almost like stagnant, I think is the word. So living standards are fundamentally driven by productivity. And that's because, you can accumulate labor and you can build more factories and do all that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, there's a natural limit to those things. And so the way in which we grow living standards is that we get better at doing stuff. And so that's this productivity story. And the problem we've had is that productivity in the last decade was the lowest it's been in sort of almost a century. And so we're in this sort of world, or at least before the Iran war, in this sort of world where living standards after COVID took a big hit. And that's because prices went right up and we had this inflation challenge and wages couldn't keep up. So you had this sort of general stagnation challenge across the economy. And so at the same time, you had the budget was in a bit of disarray. I don't really think we have a debt problem, but we did have a deficit problem because we just kept adding more and more to the debt over time. And so I think pre-Iran war, Jim Chalmers' job and what he was focusing on was how do we save a bit of money and fix the budget, and then what can we do to get productivity going? What can we do in the technology space, in the reform space, whatever it might be? And so I think those would have been his priorities, but sort of as you imply, like the Iran war has just sort of thrown all this up.
And I mean, my heart goes out to the treasurer and his state colleagues at this time. It was like, I just felt like the last 12 months, the government did a lot of hard work to try and get on top of inflation and cost of living.
Yeah.
And whether that was being felt by consumers anecdotally, or maybe you can tell me what the evidence was in terms of did the government start to get on top of inflation and cost of living pressures by the end of the calendar year of 2025? But and then all of a sudden this war started and it's like the genie's back out of the bottle again.
Yeah. I mean, I think I reckon that Jim Chalmers is sort of caught off guard a little bit, and in his defense, so was the Reserve Bank and so was everyone else. And that is that after COVID, or when the Albanese government came in, they were watching inflation come down, and it came down from a very high level that they inherited and came down quite quickly. The only challenge is that it then started increasing again pretty significantly, and then it was quite quickly outside of the RBA's band. And so I think there is an argument that, well, I think it's almost a fact that really we should have done more to try to get inflation down. That's true for the government, but it's also true for the RBA. A few people have commented in the media that, the RBA hasn't been as critical of the government as they thought they would for not getting inflation lower. And the obvious reason for that is the RBA can have the exact same criticism put to them, that you should have gone higher with interest rates in order to get rid of it. So I think we're just caught off guard more than anything.
Just a sidebar there. I know we've talked about this on the show previously, but I actually am interested in your thoughts on this. I feel like the RBA are like a footy team that's only got one tactic when it comes to addressing inflation, and that's jack up interest rates. So where are you on this as an economist? I mean, are there other levers available to the Reserve Bank to address rising costs, or is that all? Is that all they can do?
Yeah, I mean, not really. The RBA's tool is one lever, and it can either push it up or push it down, and that's interest rates. And so really when we talk about levers, it's not the levers that the RBA has, it's the levers that the government has. So a lot of people observe at the moment, which I think is true, that we are in a world which is now a stagflation world where you have both a weak economy and you have high inflation. What does the RBA do? Well, you can reduce inflation by pushing up interest rates, but then that potentially kills the patient. You cause a recession. Or they could stimulate the economy and get growth up, but then you're going to make inflation worse. And so they're in this situation where whichever way they go, it's going to end badly. And so that we really don't want to be relying on monetary policy to be doing any of this at the moment. We really want to be looking at what can the federal government do, particularly in the regulatory space, because they're in the same situation. If you spend more money as Jim Chalmers, you're going to push up inflation. But if you cut spending, you're going to hurt the economy. And so you're just in this horrible situation. And, you asked before, if you were the treasurer, well, thank God I'm not, right? Because that job would really suck at the moment. And so I feel very, very sorry for what he's sort of inherited, which is a big global shock. Fundamentally, you really can't pin this on the government. But yeah, at the end of the day, we really need the government to be focusing on what you can do in the regulatory space, because that's going to be your best bet in terms of stimulating the economy without sort of pushing up prices, and then leaving the RBA as the sort of second lever. Because if we leave it to the RBA, they're going to do the only thing they can do, which is increase interest rates to cool down inflation, but they will also potentially trigger a recession in the process. And so it's a terrible situation to be in.
Yeah, you've painted a pretty nasty one. I'll get to the ways in which the Treasurer could deal with this first, but just talk us through how has the war, I'm sure most people are across this, but in case we're missing anything, how has the war with Iran directly impacted the Australian economy? Is it just basically down to oil supply?
To a large extent. It's almost entirely the impact on oil supply. So we just did some modelling on what we reckon the impact of the Iran war will be on Australia. And we reckon that GDP growth, you're going to lose about half of our economic growth in the first year. You're going to see unemployment, which currently starts with a 4, is probably going to be at least a 5 point something. And then for inflation, we'll probably see that start, instead of starting with a 4, it'll start with a 5 or maybe start with a 6. And so the impact really is that pure, 1970s stagflation world where, because it's an external shock, it's going to really hurt growth. And that's because the economy is still, to a large extent, unfortunately, runs on oil. So we get weak GDP growth, but then you get this high inflation. And so that's really the sort of story that's going to flow through. There's a bunch of risk issues as well, just because Trump is destabilizing the world, and maybe that moves into financial markets to some extent. And that's another shock that could come through to us. But most of it's going to be coming to us through oil markets and through our dependency on foreign oil. So yeah, it's pretty bleak.
In terms of solutions, I just saw on social media today that the Prime Minister's made a bunch of announcements around fuel. Did you catch that?
Yeah, so he's reduced the fuel excise for 3 months. I think he's halved it for 3 months, yeah.
Is that the first place you would start? What is this, a Band-Aid measure, or where? I don't understand the scope of how big this problem is. You just talked about a couple of things there already, and I'm already starting to feel overwhelmed about what's going on. There's sort of how much can the government do? How would you approach this as an economist?
My approach would be, we keep talking about fuel reserves. And so Australia, depending on what type of fuel, we have something between 30 and 34 days of reserves sitting there. The way I think about it is there's 2 ways to increase your reserves. One is you can increase the numerator, so you can actually just have more barrels of oil sitting around. The other is you can shrink the denominator, so we can actually just try to use less oil as an economy, and then we have more in reserve. And so I think the thing that the government has done, it's been criticised for its tax supports for EVs, but we know that we actually have more reserves thanks to Australia's EV uptake than we would otherwise have had. So Australia's EV uptake has not been great by international standards, but it's been pretty good over time. And so we actually have more fuel in reserve thanks to that EV uptake. And if we were to have the same uptake as Norway, we'd actually get close to about half of our reserve requirements under the IEA treaty. So, those would be the things that I would be looking at, is what can we do to reduce the demand for oil in Australia? And that's things around EVs, it's things around the government itself using less oil. We use a lot in defence, for example. Do we have to be doing all that stuff at the moment? The public service use of oil and things like that, and doing more to support EVs. Trucking, there's a lot of simple things we could do in that space to reduce our demand as well. So that would be my focus. The problem with cutting the diesel rebate is that it is just a bit of a Band-Aid solution. It's very expensive. It's about $2.5 billion just for 3 months. So it's an expensive thing to do. It also doesn't really solve the problem, because all it does is make petrol a little bit cheaper temporarily for households, which sort of takes the pressure off them using less petrol. And so really they'll end up sort of using a little bit more. And so we don't really even get much of a benefit from that. So it's probably better ways that we could spend the money. But like the political pressure is huge. And I think that's just where we're at. At the end of the day, the political line would be, we are all struggling to pay for petrol and you're taxing it at the same time. And that would just be a line that would, I think, have a lot of political cut through. So I can see why they did it, but it's probably not the best idea.
And with interest about the points you said before about the modelling, is that based on how long is that based on in terms of the conflict continuing? Like, I mean, what happens if it's in its fourth or fifth week now? What happens if this extends through to, late April, May, June? Like,
yeah. I mean, that's the beauty of doing these sort of models is it forces you to make all these assumptions, and it actually really highlights just how much uncertainty there is. So really, like, the estimates I gave you are very unreliable for the simple reason that we don't know what's going to happen next. And so the assumptions built into that model, which we did about 2 weeks ago, is that oil prices would be 75% higher than what they were at the start of the year. Well, they're already higher than that. So instantly, those are undercooked, those numbers. We assume that the shock lasts for 2 years and then goes away reasonably quickly. Given we've got 20% reduced capacity in a bunch of Middle Eastern countries now, which have been bombed, so this is going to take a long time to recover. It's probably also going to take longer than 2 years. We also assume that households stop hoarding, which currently they haven't. We also have assumptions about other countries increasing supply and stepping in. Well, if those countries are also being attacked, we've had the attacks on LNG plants in Qatar and others. All of that means that probably these numbers are a bit undercooked. But also just highlights, like you say, there's just so many uncertainties and so many assumptions in this. We just don't really know what's going to happen. I mean, Donald Trump is saying it'll be all wrapped up in 2 weeks. That's sort of ludicrous. There are others who are saying this is going to, best part of a decade. So we really don't know. It's really up in the air. But the longer the shock lasts, the worse it's going to be for the Australian economy. And at the moment, my EFO had forecasted growth at 2.5%. There's not a big buffer there. So our results suggest you lose about half of that. So, that tells you straight away that if the shock was twice as bad, well, that's a recession for Australia. So we really don't know, but it's somewhere between bad and very bad at this stage.
And the flow-on effects from this into other parts of the economy, obviously cost of living, I assume that's going to become a problem again. So not just the cost of fuel, but the cost of, just household goods. What can we expect from the government in terms of trying to address that from what we've learned in the past? Obviously, when they came into government, when they defeated the Morrison government, they were handballed this ticking time bomb, which was these cost of living pressures. During the election campaign, they made a bunch of pledges about how they were going to get on top of the cost of living pressures. In some cases they didn't, but after a while I felt they found their feet. What have we learned from the behaviour of the government in terms of how they wanted to address the cost of living pressures 2 or 3 years ago compared to how it's going to impact them this time around? Are the same measures going to work this time, or are they going to have to be a bit more creative?
I think they'll have to be more creative is the short answer. I mean, the first point is that if they do nothing, then the RBA will just jack up interest rates substantially. And potentially trigger a recession as a result. Like, that's the do nothing situation. So it's that classic line that doing nothing is also a decision, and we know what that looks like. And so, can they do what they did when they got in? Well, when they got in, inflation was starting to tick down a little bit from a very high level. They did put in place some household supports and things like that, which they could sort of get away with because some of the heat was coming out of the economy. Interest rates had gone up a lot, and interest rates take about a year and a half to have an effect. And so they started to bite, and that's one of the reasons we started seeing inflation coming down. So they had a little bit more room to maneuver, whereas I feel like in this situation, the RBA is already talking about inflation spiking up beyond sort of 5-6%. The economy is just looking increasingly weak. It just means that their ability to maneuver on anything in terms of spending money is going to be very hard. And so I think that's why, my short answer is they have to get more creative, and they have to start thinking about what are the simple things or quick things that you can do in the regulatory space to try to get prices down. And so that'll be things like just immediately scrapping any remaining tariffs that Australia has, for example. It would mean if something is for sale in the US or in Europe and it's already been approved for sale in those countries, in that region, well, then it should be allowed to be sold here immediately. We shouldn't have to go through a regulatory process, where some pharmaceutical products will take 2 years to get approved in Australia, which have already been approved in the EU. If the EU's approved something, it's probably safe. They're pretty strict over there. And so they're going to have to get a lot more creative on these things. And so, I think that would be the world they'll probably find themselves in.
I like how you said if it was safe in the EU, then it's probably safe, as opposed to if it was safe in the United States, it would be.
Looking at some of the RFK stuff at the moment, I'm like, well, maybe we'll stick with the EU on this one. But.
Yeah, and we've all seen the health ads on US TV. Productivity.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding what's going on in the world right now, what was your takeout from the productivity roundtable, or I can't remember what the name of it was. What was your initial takeout of that meeting? Because you said this is the lowest productivity is the lowest this century. Why is that? Why is that the case right now?
Yeah. Productivity is very low at the moment because in many respects we haven't done much reform. And so the way, people like Rod Sims, the analogy he uses is that reform is a little bit like walking up the escalator that's going in the other direction. If you're not moving forward, you're going to be moving backwards. And so the challenge is that we haven't sort of kept up the reform effort. And it means that over time, we just accumulate more and more regulation and things like that. And we just haven't really done a good job of keeping that sort of clean. It's also business investment has been very low. So that would be another big driver, is that over time, we've in the last 10 years, business investment was down about a third compared to its sort of long run average. And so that's another big challenge there. I think a lot of people are looking at technology and tech adoption as being the solution and being the thing that will sort of really come through there. But those are the main sort of drivers at this stage, we think.
What kind of mood did you get from the government after that productivity roundtable meeting in terms of what you thought they were going to start to address? Because obviously we're all talking about stuff around capital gains and housing and franking and a lot of things that were talked about in the fateful 2019 campaign. And it was like the Labor Party they don't want to touch that ever again. And then Allegra Spender then writes this article in the AFR, which is her white paper, and then actually does some really good social media on it as well. I don't know if anyone's visited Allegra's Instagram account, but it actually just really simplifies what could be quite a complex concept. And I'm just kind of get a sense of where do you think the government was heading in terms of productivity and addressing some of the things that they wouldn't have normally wanted to touch because of what happened in 2019 and Bill Shorten losing election on a reform agenda.
Yeah. I think it's just another example of why Jim Chalmers has a crappy job, I think, in many respects, because I think what he was trying to do with the roundtable was to sort of whip up a little bit of support, both within the business community, but I suspect also within his own government, to really sort of get a bit of a burning platform that we need to do reform and we need to lift productivity, and we've got this sort of really big problem. And so he had this roundtable, and it brought together a whole bunch of economists and a whole bunch of people from across industry. And I think they spent a long time admiring the problem, which economists are very, very good at. There's a big productivity problem. It's bad for living standards, and this is terrible. And what should we do about it? And things like that. And then you don't really get into the detail on, well, what should we actually do? And when you ask that question, that's when people will say, economists will say, you should do tax reform. Like, that's the solution. Well, what specifically do you want to do in the tax reform space? And I think as soon as the roundtable started getting into that sort of territory, that was when suddenly you found there was no agreement whatsoever. So there was a lot of agreement that productivity is a problem. There's a lot of agreement we need to do something about it. A lot of agreement that tax reform is going to be one of the biggest things you could do to support it. But then as soon as the Productivity Commission said, well, let's have a cash flow tax for 5% of corporate profits or whatever it was, everyone hit the roof. And suddenly there was no agreement at all. And so I think that was his goal. His goal was to try to sort of build up that burning platform. And it probably wasn't that successful because I think you started just getting a big backlash against this sort of cash flow tax idea and other things. And I think, what Chalmers is probably trying to do at the moment, which I suspect he might be more successful for, is now he really has a burning platform. Now we're in a situation where a lot of very serious people around the world are very, very worried about what's happening. We're potentially going to see even worse growth, much higher inflation. He now has the burning platform, I think, to do something. And so I think he will try to use this again to get something done. I feel like he has a much better chance than earlier on. Because my personal view is, I think that Albo thinks very politically about these things. And he saw that the opposition was just decimated, barely had a leader at the time. Why would I bring them together doing a big tax reform thing and, unite the enemy when we could not do that? And also, I'm not convinced we even really have a huge problem at the moment. Whereas now I think all of that has changed a bit. I think, the Libs have sort of got themselves together a little bit, although the polling is diabolical from what I saw this morning. But yeah, I think the burning platform is there. And so I think the odds of us getting some successful reform is probably going to be a bit higher, I would have thought.
If you had a magic wand, what would your top 3 reform agenda items be that you'd want to tackle?
Depends how you define single thing. Like Allegra Spender's package of tax reforms, I think, are pretty sensible. And if you take all of those as a package, I think that would be your best bet for increasing productivity. But there's a lot in that. I think you'd get a lot of disagreement from different parts of the business community. And I think that would probably start a bit of a fight. I think probably one of the easiest things you can do, particularly in the current environment, is you get rid of parallel import restrictions on secondhand EVs, which is very, very nerdy. But we basically have this rule at the moment that you're not allowed to import secondhand EVs into Australia. You're allowed to do it in New Zealand, and their secondhand EVs are about 40% cheaper than in Australia. So in the current environment, I think that's one of the easiest things you could do. Very quickly expand the size of the global market that's available to us to get more EVs and to reduce our dependency on foreign oil, and it would boost productivity in the short run as well. So I think there's a bunch of things in there, and then the international standards thing as well. I think if something's for sale in the EU, you should be able to sell it in Australia. That would have a pretty big effect as well, getting prices down and boosting productivity as well.
Why, to those last 2 points, they seem very practical. So I'm trying to understand why we don't enable secondhand EVs to be sold in the Australian market, or why we don't have cheap pharmaceuticals in Europe being sold here in Australia as well.
Well, you don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but there are just a bunch of vested interests in this sort of space. So the reason we didn't allow parallel imports was because we used to have a car-making industry in Australia, and we didn't want people importing a second-hand Vauxhall if there was a Holden being made in Australia. And so we basically gave Holden the right to stop people from importing those second-hand cars to protect our domestic industry. Whatever you think of protectionism, like that was the idea behind it. The irony now is that we don't actually make cars in Australia anymore, but we still have that framework in place where you're not allowed to bring them in. And so the big car manufacturers are still very much in favor of keeping them in place because they don't want secondhand cars coming in and competing. And I think the reason the government didn't do it is because they put in place the national vehicle emission standards. They were already asking car manufacturers to do a lot, and they probably didn't want to hit them with this at the same time. But, a bit of time has passed now, so I think that's, you're pretty safe to do that now. For importing things more generally, it tends to depend on a whole bunch of different industries. But in things like pharmaceuticals, for example, you have a big framework with the TGA and others who manage this. A lot of them would be out of the job if we just allowed things in that came from the EU. There are very genuine reasons for not wanting to have a blanket situation where you can bring everything in. So in agriculture, for example, there's a mad cow disease and things like that. You don't want any of that stuff coming in. And so all of that muddies it up a little bit as well. And so, yeah, I think it is just a lot of vested interest in these areas. And so, yeah, people kick up a stink if you try to change them, which is what makes these things so difficult. But, yeah.
We had Emma Dawson on the podcast maybe last month, and she was actually talking about sort of the structural problems with the Australian economy with a smaller, younger population, working population that can't get into the housing market, and it's a smaller group to try and tax to then pay for an expensive cohort of the community, which is our retirees and sort of the boomer community. And healthcare and health coverage and all that kind of stuff. And so there's this imbalance that's happening right now. Is it as simple as that? How do you see the way that this imbalance and that leading to challenges? Is that fair? And if so, how would you think about trying to readdress that to create some balance in the Australian economy?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Emma, and I think it is, to be honest, that simple. If you look at the data on income growth in the last 10 years, it's been large, even before COVID, so in like the 2010s, it was largely stagnant for a lot of cohorts in Australia. The only exception is young people who actually went backwards. So it's not that their incomes didn't grow by as much, which annoyed all of us. It's that their income actually fell. And if you look at all of the stats on Gen Zs, they're really terrible. And there's really is a big challenge that we have around youth suicide, but also just the general welfare of young people in Australia. And I think to make that worse, when you look at our policy settings, I think this goes to what Emma was saying, they're all geared towards older people and are not geared towards younger people. When we look at the sort of concessions you get in superannuation, when we look at concessions around housing, all of these sort of policies are geared towards older people and are making life pretty difficult for young people. I think the biggest one is housing. And so most of the challenge in housing, there are things you can do on the demand side, and that's things like negative gearing and capital gains tax discount. The government's talking about sort of halving that. That I think makes sense. And negative gearing, I think, is a distortion. You should just get rid of it. I don't think it's going to have a huge benefit. I think the biggest story is on the supply side, and that is around planning and zoning restrictions and doing everything we can to learn from what other countries have done that's been very successful in increasing their housing supply and increasing density in the cities. I think that's the easiest thing you can do to try to help the young people in Australia is going to be the sort of housing story. They might benefit a bit more from improvements in technology like AI, which they potentially will grab better than other areas of the community, and they can benefit more from that. So that's great, but you don't want to necessarily put a bet on that, whereas we know that the housing situation in particular would be a direct benefit that they would receive from that.
I had lunch with an old high school buddy of mine who, shall we say, is on the opposite side of the political spectrum when it comes to this podcast. But I love him dearly. And he's almost like, he's not politically active like folks that listen to this show, but he's got political opinions. He's almost from sort of centre-right central casting. He runs his own business. He's very successful. He's very hardworking. He was born into a family of small business people, so he's sort of brought up in that kind of tradition, and wants to be feels that the economy should reward him for his hard work, and if that means taking the profits that he makes from running his business and then investing it in housing, he thinks that's the most effective way for him to increase his returns, basically.
That's true.
Yeah. And I said to him, and I just said to him, look, but the problem is he's got two young daughters and they're about to want to get into the housing market.
Yeah.
And I posed to him this structural problem that you and I just spoke about then. And I said, it's also very unproductive if we put money just into housing. We have to find other ways. And he came back at me and said, you're right, Stephen, I hadn't actually considered that. So should I just put my money in shares? And I said, actually, I don't know. That also sounds very unproductive. Yeah. Where else can people like our friends that I'm talking about, where can they, if we don't want them to put the money in housing so we can free up the housing market for, and I know you're talking about it's actually a supply problem, but how can we be more productive with our money, so we get a return, but also we're injecting it back into the Australian economy that ensures that it continues to grow at the pace that we need it to?
I mean, the answer that I would give to that is just the most like wanky, useless economist answer. But the answer for me is that you don't want people's decisions to be being driven by tax policies. And I think this is something that Allegra Spender said the other day, which I thought was a really good point, where she was sort of just highlighting what tax rates you pay depending on where your money comes from. If your money comes from your wage and you're in the highest tax bracket, you're paying 47%. If it comes through superannuation, it's probably 15%. If it comes through a company, it's 30%. If it comes through an inheritance, it's 0. If it comes through cash franking credit refunds, it's negative something. And if it comes through your investment property, it's also a negative number. And the moral of the story being that we shouldn't have that difference. There shouldn't be so many different tax rates available. And the fact that people sort of have to go with a worse return in order to do what they think is ethical and productive is a terrible situation to be in. We shouldn't be in a situation where you have to ask those questions. We want to have a situation where it doesn't matter where your income comes from, that you're paying the same rate, more or less, unless there's some big public policy benefit from having a difference, like charitable donations or something like that. I'm open to that being sort of an exception. But in many ways, I mean, that's the productivity killer, is that we've just got all of these distortions through our tax code, which are just pushing money towards random things without actually thinking about if we really need those things. The better thing to do would be to just have it as a bit of a level playing field, and then whatever the most productive return is will emerge as getting a better return. So again, a bit of a wanky economist answer, but I think that's the core problem, is that we've just got this situation where so much of the capital in the economy is just being driven by tax policy rather than being driven by that productivity story, which will emerge itself if we sort of get out of the way.
Your time at Brookings, I'm interested to get a sense of the impact the current US administration is having on the global markets, but in particular how it's impacting on Australia. If you were working in Treasury these days, or if you're working for the government, how you're trying to manage the relationship with the United States whilst you need to have your head on a swivel to keep up to date with the different positions of the President Trump. I just want to initially get your overview of what you've observed since Trump's come back into the White House in the second term, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about how you would handle that.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think the government's actually doing a really good job in managing this situation because it is so difficult. I mean, you look at just the other day, Albo would have woken up and he was getting attacked by Trump because he wasn't providing military support in Iran. And Albo was never even asked to provide military support in Iran. And, you really sort of can't win. And odds are he probably just picked Australia out of his head. Like, I don't think we actually did anything to sort of annoy him. So it's a really difficult situation to be in. I think if you're the government and what you basically want to do is sort of hedge at the moment, you want to make sure that publicly everything that you're doing is strengthening the Australia-US relationship. Like it or not, we are outrageously dependent on America as almost our entire defense strategy. So you would be crazy to do anything to jeopardize that. And I think the government is, and so did the Liberals before Albanese. You want to do everything you can to try to keep that relationship strong and keep them engaged. But then quietly behind the scenes, you really want to be decoupling away from America. You want to do everything that you can, certainly in the defense space, to try to build up our own capabilities there. You don't want to be dependent on them for anything in the military space, but also in the economic space as well. And so you want to avoid being tied up with them as much as possible and try to bolster our resilience a bit more. And I think that's what quietly the government is doing. I think some of the defense announcements, I think they're moving in that sort of direction. But yeah, that would definitely be the strategy, I think, is public, very strong relationship, but privately you want to be diversifying and looking at Asia and trying to find our security with our sort of ASEAN partners more and more and things like that.
Did you catch those remarks by Andrew Hastie on Insiders on Sunday morning? I just saw the sort of back and forth with David Spears. The tone from Hastie about Australia's relationship with the United States, the challenges that you just quite succinctly outlined that we are having right now with the current administration. David Spears asked a couple of questions that were almost like feelings questions. How do you feel right now with the way that things are tracking with the United States? And he was like, I'm very pro-American, but this is incredibly difficult. And I was like, oh, well, that's quite refreshing. People who have been listening to this show for a very long time will know that obviously I too share his sympathies with the United States in that I'm very pro-American, but it's really difficult right now, and I just found it quite interesting that it was actually. I know he's not the leader of the coalition, but he certainly is an important person within that group. It did seem like there was a bit of bipartisanship coming out of outside of politics.
I think it's good. I mean, I think that on the other side, they can see just how hard this is to manage. And hopefully, they would say, well, we want to make sure that politics ends at the border, particularly on something this important. And so I think it's really refreshing. I mean, the sort of optimist in me would say that if the thing that sets America apart from every other country in the world is its ability to reinvent itself. It is an amazing ability to do that. And other countries like China, they cannot reinvent themselves without a full-blown civil war. Their political system is fragile, their economy is fragile, their financial system is fragile, their balance of payments is fragile. Everything about China is just a giant plate of glass, right? Whereas America is super flexible and does reinvent itself. So, I mean, that's my sort of optimistic sort of take on the US. My sort of pessimistic take is that the thing driving a lot of this isn't just things that are happening politically, but there's really structural inequalities in America, and there is this structural polarization that's going to take a really long time to fix. And so I think even if you do get sort of a better situation after the midterms, after the next presidential election, I think still the trust and confidence in America has been sort of destroyed for quite a long time, and you'd be very silly, I think, as a country to just think that everything's okay when I think you've got those structural problems that are still sitting underneath there. But yeah, bipartisan approach I think is really important, I reckon.
I do think that sometimes we do need to remind ourselves that our issues that we may have are not with the United States of America. It's with the particular administration that are governing that country right now. And it is a democracy, and not without its challenges to its democratic norms in the last decade, but it can easily turn around with the election of a different administration. And you're right, if the Democrats were successful at the next presidential elections in 2028, you would imagine that they would do a lot of heavy lifting to try and restore bilateral and multilateral relationships it has with its partners in the region. That doesn't mean to say that that everything is fixed, because obviously a Republican administration can come back in again and be, if it's of that MAGA type approach, then we could have those problems. So there's a lot of unpredictability in that. But I think that, if I can echo the optimistic side of what you're saying, I think that things can turn around. And it wasn't that long ago that we were all saying how much we all didn't like George W. Bush, and now he's almost like a hero. There was an absolute lefty friend of mine said to me quite privately the other day, going, "You can't help but not like George W. Bush, can you?" And I said, "I won't tell you what you said that. I'll just mention it on the podcast." So, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that this story is ever the story of America is ever unfolding and continues to evolve. But I take your point as well. We do probably need to stand on our own 2 feet. That's not cheap, though, Adam.
I mean, in many respects, the one of the best things that could happen is if Trump just ditched AUKUS completely, and suddenly the Albanese government has $380, whatever the current number is, $1 billion that it can now spend on defense. And you could use that money to learning from Ukraine, learning from what we're seeing in Iran and elsewhere. Invest in those new defense technologies around drones and unmanned sea drones and things like that. seems to me, and I'm just really plagiarizing, Hugh White and a bunch of other academics who know a lot more about this stuff. But it does seem to me like that would be one of the best things that could happen, that it will just free up all this fiscal space and you can use that to then move into technologies that will probably be more valuable than having 3 nuclear submarines where 2 of them are out of action most of the time, or whatever the number is. But yeah.
Final questions, turning to the budget in May. I know that it's only around the corner, but it'll probably feel like it'll take 10 months to get there.
Yeah.
What are your expectations to come out of the budget this year?
I was actually lucky enough to be in one of these little roundtables with the Treasurer a couple of weeks ago. And his comment there was, and this was before Iran really started getting bad, but he was saying that the main focus will be on savings, it'll be on productivity, and it'll be on cost of living. I don't think Iran necessarily changes those things, but I think there will be a bunch of things that they'll try to do in the probably adding another bucket, which will be something like resilience. And I think they'll be looking at their Future Made in Australia program and expanding some areas in that under the resilience banner. But I think the challenge is whether or not they're able to balance those different things. Getting savings is going to be hard if you're also trying to do cost of living support. And so I think they'll probably struggle in that regard. I suspect Chalmers, his preferred direction would be to reduce government spending, do some more regulatory reform on the productivity side, whereas I feel like Albanese is probably more in the how do we give more money to struggling households and what can we do in that space. And I'm not too worried about the reform side and the budget side. And so I think that's the tension. We'll sort of see where they land. But it is just going to be such an important budget because everyone is going to be looking at them, expecting a lot and expecting a bunch of things that are in contradiction to each other as well, which is going to make it really hard, I think.
Well, I'm sure that it will all play out over the next couple of months, and who knows what's going to happen with foreign conflicts and global markets and whatnot. But yeah, you're right. It will make for an interesting budget. Maybe we'll get you back on the show and do a bit of a post-budget debrief. Yeah,
absolutely. This has all been a bit bleak, so hopefully we'll have some positive things to talk about.
Yeah, I know. Tell you what, you took us into the valley of darkness there right at the start, and I was really trying to...
Yeah. I was trying to be optimistic, but maybe my blood sugar's low or something. But,
Adam Triggs, co-founder at Mandala, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it. I love your work, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Social Democrats. Thanks for listening. Today's episode was hosted by myself, Stephen Donnelly, and produced by Grace Eyre. If you like the show, please rate us and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really like the show, then join our Patreon community for early and ad-free access to each episode. We regularly take questions and comments from our Patreon members, so get in there if you want to have your say. And finally, get all the latest updates and bonus content by following Socially Democratic on our social media channels. The links are in our show notes. See you next Friday.